Welcome back to Tom's World Scale Model Series. In this episode, we complete our build of the Meng 1/35th scale Renault FT-17 light tank. If you enjoy programming on scale modeling, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Leave us a comment, like, dislike, or share the video with friends. Clicking the notification bell gives you alerts when we post new content, or visit the channel Tom's World for a friendly visit for a complete list of all our videos. We made good progress in part 1 of our build. In the box we found crisp and exquisitely molded parts, clear instructions, and solid kit engineering. The mitered faceted construction of the hull and turret was a bit of a challenge, and we put our acrylic putty to good use on the more misbehaving seams. The road wheels, and as we later found out the tracks, both require a time investment for cleanup. But the working and articulated running assembly when completed is impressive. With all our parts cleaned up, we're ready to embark on the final stages of this build. So stick with us as we take this fascinating project through to its exciting conclusion. With our parts cleaned up and our sub-assemblies complete, it was time to start painting. I opted to go with the US Army variant of the vehicle. I rather like the tricolored paint scheme depicted in the color guide. Paint scheme is reminiscent of the late World War II era colors that the Germans used. As a result, I wanted to avoid using the same tones as the German color scheme. Unfortunately, the kit's depiction of the colors vary. For example, the tones shown on the color guide, the top box art, and the side box art all vary. As confusing are the paint suggestions. The paint guides on the side of the box and in the instructions call for light French brown as the main color. Looking at the swatches depicted on AK Interactive's website, this color matches the paint guide pretty closely, but I found in the end that this faded washed out desert yellow is a bit dull for my taste. It's the same story with the French brown and the French green. Both colors are pretty dull and in my opinion lack vibrance and tonal spunk. To be sure, I'll use the camo pattern off the color guide, but I'll alter the colors. If we compare Tamiya's XF60 dark yellow Dunkelgelb to the guide, we see the yellow matches just about perfectly. I definitely don't want to use German World War II tank colors on my World War I French tank. For the base color I used enamels, Model Master's US Army Marine Sand as a base tinted with Testra's yellow and Model Master white. For the red brown I used Tamiya's Hull Red lightened with a little flat white. The third color was Tamiya's Olive Green. I used it straight out of the bottle without tinting. You can use whatever paint mediums you're most comfortable with. Having decided on the paint scheme and colors, it was time to put in our shadow coat. I ran out of the Testra's flat black enamel that I usually use, so it was substituted with Tamiya's flat black acrylic. I cut the acrylic with Tamiya's lacquer thinner. A ratio of 60:40 of thinner to paint and gradually built up coats gives us a silky smooth finish. I sprayed the remaining interior surfaces with Tamiya white, then a gloss clear coat. The remaining interior surfaces were chipped and weathered in the same way that our driver's compartment and turret interiors were done, as illustrated in part 1 of this video build. The forms on the running gear are quite intricate and a little challenging to spray with our paintbrush. Leaving the return roller bars loose makes the job much easier. Take your time and inspect your work to make sure you don't miss any spots with your paint. Here's the little Pateau SA 1918 37mm gun. The molding is excellent and I will model the turret doors open so we can see the gun. And here are all the parts in their lemony yellow base coat. This tone of yellow is much warmer and vibrant than the AK light French brown or the XF50 that we looked at. We want to start with a relatively bright color since our weathering will dull it down anyway. The bright yellow will also give the model a vintage and a slightly exotic look. You could brush paint the camouflage pattern, but I prefer painting with an airbrush. When examining the camouflage pattern, I didn't think I could capture the intricacy of the green and brown patterns freehand with an airbrush. The intricacy of the structure makes masking with tape impractical, so I settled on the spaghetti method. This method uses tacky, non-drying putty. Blue tack, thinking putty, panzer putty. Some people even use silly putty, but it may not have enough tack. I use this Elmer's tack product since my local art supply store stocked it. It has the consistency of plasticine, it leaves no residue, and it's got some stickiness or tack. We can easily shape it with our fingers. Traditionally, the putty is rolled out before it's applied. Can you guess why it's called the spaghetti method? As a guide, I drew on the camouflage pattern with soft pencil lines. We then lay on the putty, being careful to follow the curvy camouflage patterns, working on one color at a time or masking off the areas that'll get our green. We can get sharp or soft lines depending on how we prepare our painted edges. I went for sharp edges. I then fill in the gaps with masking tape, and on went our green color. This method of masking is time consuming, but the result is quite beautiful. Given the intricate forms and curvy camouflage patterning, brush painting or tacky putting masking are two relatively easy methods to achieve the look. And here are the parts after we repeat the process for a brown color. Our little mud puppy is starting to take on personality. Next, we apply a clear gloss coat to seal in our base colors. No problems with the decals in this kit. We soak them in warm water and we slide them onto the model. I apply a coat of decal setting solution. I use Microsol, but any brand will do. A couple of coats of the solution softens the decal so it adheres and conforms to the surface it's stuck to. I then press the decal with a cotton swab and roll out any trapped air bubbles. The decals are opaque, so the dark colors beneath don't bleed through. The decals are also fairly thick, but this isn't a problem since we're mounting them on flat surfaces. The numeric symbols, in this case the numbers 5, are tiny. We can easily miss them on the decal sheet or confuse them with a decal identifier number. Be on the lookout for these. Our vehicle's weathering is built up with layers. The process starts with streaks. Fighting vehicles in the field get covered with dust, dirt, and mud. Rain, condensation, and other moisture causes this filth to wash down the vehicle, and that's the effect we're replicating. I start by drawing lines with oil paint. Here I use burnt umber, white, yellow ochre, and black. Then with a soft wide brush moistened with a little mineral spirits, I blend the streaks. I draw the colored lines and blend them in the direction that water would naturally run down the vehicle. Since oil paint dries slowly, we have a lot of working time. The amount you lighten and blend the streaks is really a matter of taste. You can leave them quite stark or blend them so they're very light. And here's the finished look. Our streaking softens the camouflage pattern edges and slightly fades and filters our foundation coats. This technique gives us a subtle, streaked, and dirty look. It's a great base, but let's keep layering. Next comes a pin wash. I use oil colors ranging from burnt umber to black, heavily diluted with mineral spirits so it flows easily. I touch the bolts and other raised details so the paint flows on through capillary action. I'm pretty generous with the amount of paint I deposit, and I only touch the yellow areas. We have to judge our paint's drying time. Too wet and it will smear if we try to blend it. Too dry and it won't blend at all. If it's too wet, just wait a little while. If the paint is too dry and doesn't blend, just use a tiny touch of spirits on your brush to reactivate it. In general though, we want a dry brush for this blending. As you work with your paints, you get to know how long they take to dry, but generally wet oil paint is shiny, so when it dulls down it's likely ready to be blended. And here's the look we're after. The dark brown colored pin wash looks great on the yellow, but it doesn't work as well on the green or the brown. To pin wash over these colors, I mix up a dirty buff color, a light sienna reminiscent of dried mud or dirt. I get this color by mixing yellow ochre, burnt umber, white, and just a touch of green. This light sienna color is pin washed over the green and brown detailed areas. We repeat the blending process on these darker areas. Although applying two different pin wash colors seems unnatural, when seen in context to the overall aesthetic of the vehicle, the colors seem to blend seamlessly. Next, I apply some very dark and black discoloration in certain areas of the structure. We can darken edges, suggest shadows, create bare metal patches, and color in grease stains. The trick is to use a very light dabbing and blending motion with very little paint on our bristles. Using the same technique, I use a yellowish off-white color to create highlights. The dark and light colors create depth and gives our surface a sun-faded, gently modulating, almost speckled surface. And here's the look so far, but let's take it even further. Let's keep layering and really lift the surface even higher. I'll start with deep chips and scratches. I paint these on with a brush using a light buff color. Don't add too many of these types of chips. It's easy to overdo it, and painting on too many of these deep chips can really spoil the look of the model. We then paint a dark gray metal color inside the buff color chips, careful to leave a light colored border on each chip. If done right, we get a very realistic, almost three-dimensional paint chip. And finally, we add more chips with a sponge. I like to use enamel paint for chipping since I get a longer drying time and more durability than I would if I used acrylics. And here's the look so far. The hull looks great, but most of it's hidden by the enormous running gear. Still, it's a great exercise to work on these parts. We can see how our color and technique is working. Any mistakes will be mitigated since these surfaces are largely hidden once we assemble the model. Finishing these obscured areas on a model is a sign of conscientious building. Never underestimate what model contest judges can see with their little flashlights. I repeat the streaks, pin wash, and chipping on the inside of the running gear. This riser that sits atop the bogie struts builds up with two obvious seams. If we look closely at this vehicle that sits in the Polish Army Museum, we can see there is in fact a seam here. To my eye, the seam is unsightly, and I think most judges would likely interpret this as sloppy model building. A better solution would be to add a scale weld bead over the seam, but I opted for tiny bits of very thin styrene. After painting, the modification is totally unnoticeable. Probably not very realistic, but to my eye, much nicer. When we unboxed the kit, that exquisitely molded builder's plate on the side of the bogie running beam really caught my eye. The plate on the real vehicle is brass, and I couldn't resist replicating this. I dug out my AK True Metal paint tube, which we purchased for our Hummel build. I used a little mineral spirits to thin it so it would go on smoothly with a brush, and I carefully colored in the plaque. The finished look is great. The vehicle's idle wheel is made of wood, but it has a steel rim. I was careful not to overspray the flat enamel black base on the idle wheel rims. Over top the black base, I used my soft lead pencil to give the rim a dark steel look. I press hard with the pencil to polish the graphite onto the surface. We want to get the edges as well. And here's the finished look. The drive sprockets get the same treatment. I'll also give some of the raised surfaces a swipe of the pencil to give the impression of polished bare steel. I went around the model and hit other edges with the pencil. This really brings the model to life. The odd glint of light attracts the eye. This technique gives the impression that the model is made of steel, and the shiny worn metal edges create a sense of weight. Time to turn our attention to the tracks. We want to get our tracks assembled and attached before we start to weather the running gear. Every link pad has a little odd sprue nipple, and these are a real pain to clean up. I used a very sharp blade to cut off the little stub, but I couldn't avoid pitting the surface. I suspect when the parts were released from their molds, the process created stress cracks on each pad. The pitting is, unfortunately, unavoidable. I started the cleaning process with a file. Even with pretty aggressive filing, the pit remained visible. Obviously the pits are quite deep. I had to follow up with pretty aggressive sanding to get a smooth surface. And here's the final look. I had to remove quite a bit of the surface to fully remove the pitting. Still, I was grateful that the pads were individually molded, since sprue gates would have made cleaning the pads even more onerous. The kit requires a total of 64 links, so it's a bit of a time investment to get them all prepared for painting. The tracks then got a flat black enamel base coat, and I lightly oversprayed them with a brown color that I mixed up using flat black, brown, and a touch of red acrylic Tamiya paint. The tracks then got a gloss clear coat. The tracks are easy to assemble and don't require glue. Each link has two little nipples on one end and corresponding holes on the other. We just press them together with a friction fit. Once assembled, the tracks are somewhat flexible and resemble the real article in look and action quite well. The joints are adequate but not overly strong, so care must be exercised when working with them. To muck up the tracks, I'll use pigments, and here are the colors and brands that I use. It's a good idea to match the color to the terrain where the vehicle is operating, but I found these three colors work in almost any situation. It's much easier to gunk up the outside surfaces of the tracks when they're off the model, and I worked in short sections for convenience. With a large soft brush, I deposit little piles of the light sienna pigment over the tracks. I'm generous with the application, and I tap the powder into the nooks and crannies. I then gently sprinkle a little of the dark mud color over top. This is followed by a light sprinkle of the light dust color. It's important to use more than one color since we're looking for variety and randomness in the tones. Next, we flood the surface with fixer. We can use a dedicated pigment fixer, or Tamiya's X20 acrylic thinner works well too. Here I'm using plain old isopropyl alcohol. The pigments turn very dark when wet, but lighten dramatically once the fixer dries. I then rub my pencil on the little pad lips to give them a worn metal look. And here's the finished look. Before we attach the track, I wanted to point out the working track tensioning that's designed into the kit. Like the real vehicle, our model's track tension is kept by these spring-loaded return roller beams. The mechanism also allows us to move the idler wheel, which further tensions the track. The spring is definitely out of scale, but the whole workable running gear assembly in this kit is quite impressive. I dry fit the running assembly to the hull so I can work out the best approach for weathering the vehicle's lower extremities. The lower sides of the hull and the inside surfaces of the running assemblies are exposed, and those areas would be very hard to reach if we were to attach them before weathering them. Dry fitting the running gear also lets me see how high up the hull sides the muck and dust has to go. The same pigments are used for the hull sides as were used on the tracks, following the same process. With a large soft brush, I deposit little piles of the light sienna pigment. I build up little piles of the stuff just like real mud and dirt would collect on a real vehicle. I go heavier on the lower parts of the hull and lighten the application as it climbs up the sides. I then load up my brush with the mud color, and with a tapping motion I sprinkle it here and there to create darker areas. I follow up with the tiniest amount of our light dust color, again tapping the brush to get localized and controlled sprinkles. These areas are then flooded with fixer. Once the fixer dries, I did a little blending with dry pigments to clean up tide marks and other irregularities. I carried the light dust color up the hull, applying it dry and blending it gently to get feathered edges. Much of these areas won't be seen once the running gear is attached, but we want to give it some attention. The weathering doesn't have to be perfect, but it does have to be there. We repeat the same pigment weathering application on the inside of the running assembly. This is the finished look we're after. We can add as much dirt, mud, and dust as we want, but I didn't want to cover too much of the beautiful surface detail of this kit. The running assemblies are finally mated with the hull. Like most World War I era tanks, the FT-17 is also based on an agricultural tractor design. The 17's running assembly is the dominant feature, and the tractor design influence is strikingly apparent. Before we can finish weathering the rest of the vehicle, we have a few odds and ends to attach to the hull. As we carry our dust and dirt up the model, we want to weather the little loose parts as part of the whole vehicle. My muffler got a quick and dirty rust finish using dry pigments. Over top the flat black enamel base coat, I blend 3 different colors to get the effect. I've been using these Meng rust colored pigments for years and I love the colors. They were great on model mufflers. The kit provides 2 near microscopic brass tool straps, one of which I've painted leather brown here. Note the size compared to an X-Acto number 11 blade. These proved too stiff for my clumsy hands and one even flew off into carpet oblivion. I replaced the PE tiny straps with sticky masking tape held in place with CA glue. I then overpainted the tape with a leather brown enamel. They look okay. When the model is viewed from a distance, these straps are almost imperceptible anyway. The TC Gunner strap looks great and it paints up nice, but it's an absolute bear to attach to the turret. If building this model again, I would consider a softer, more pliable alternative to this brass part. To finish the model, we repeat the same pigment weathering application as we did for the lower hull and the inside of the running gear. And with that, our little trench puppy is ready for its photo shoot. Because of the model's diminutive size, it's easy to underestimate the work involved to complete it. Its faceted build-up, unusual forms and assemblies, and the many tiny and delicate parts will test and challenge the builder. This is definitely not a kit for the very young or inexperienced. But with the challenge comes great reward, as Meng's little FT-17, in experienced and steady hands, is a sure standout at any model contest or show. Meng's clever kit engineering, which replicates the real vehicle's articulated running gear and track tensioning, made the build both fun and educational, and the step back in time to an earlier era of pioneer tank engineering was truly fascinating. The kit's exquisite molding and detail is outstanding, and the kit's reasonable price make it a tempting addition to any serious modeler's bench. And that'll do it for this Meng's FT-117 build. Join us again for more unboxing and builds coming up, or check out our library of previous scale model videos. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like, dislike, or drop us a comment, or visit the channel for a friendly visit for a list of all our videos. As always, keep building, stay well, and all the best.